Okay, so we're recording. You're good to go, Andre.
All right. So I remember you, Camille, asking me back in the fall about doing something for you guys, specifically the juniors, about warming up. And we just didn't make that connection. I think I was leaving town before we had the chance to meet up. So I'm glad I've got the opportunity to do that with you guys here today. So this particular presentation, it is kind of thrown together. And this will obviously be my first time through it since I put it together. But I will talk about rowing warm-ups, and this is aimed more at a general audience. So it is a little lighter on the theory, though I encourage you guys to ask me questions throughout. I specifically aim this at recreational rowers and rowers learning to train, training to train, and training to compete. Because this is what I would consider like the minimal warming up required for a good workout. And but like we kind of talked about in our preamble there, if you're training for the Olympics or if you're training for a Henley final, if you're very serious, there is more that you can do and likely should do, at least from a physiological background. So what is the warm-up? So everybody knows that you do some form of exercise prior to starting your exercise session, but you might get a variety of answers back when you ask them why should we do it. So we are aiming to increase somebody's body temperature. We want to increase their active range of motion and or stability. So I've stated active range of motion here as opposed to just range of motion. In the short term, it's very difficult to make actual changes in range of motion. So like range of motion is in the end range of a joint. You can get some small transient effects, but when I say active range of motion, I want you to envision that it is the range of motion that you feel comfortable exercising. We'll go on to discuss that more later. So we're also increasing body awareness, we're increasing neuromuscular function, we're increasing energy system activation, and we're decreasing risk of injury and decreasing the risk of adverse events. So this all contributes to improving the performance during the workout. That might help your enjoyment, but it will also definitely reduce the risk of any event. So going too hard, too fast makes it a much more difficult transition for your body to go from rest to exercise. It's better that there is something in between ramping it up. So to start off a warm-up, you would have some type of light aerobic activity. So I personally, when I've been training with a variety of rowing teams, we would start out with 5 to 10 minutes of continuous jogging. If somebody could not jog for some reason, there would be some other type of stationary continuous exercise. This gets the energy systems starting to work. So this is just at a very low intensity. Really the purpose here is to warm up your body temperature. You could do this with passive heating, so just like wearing layers and hanging out at the boathouse. This would have been a good spot for another little inlet from a research paper. But we know that exercise works better than just passive heating at all alone. That's likely due to some of these other contributions of the warm-up, so more energy system activation, for example. So a dynamic warm-up would be immediately following the aerobic light intensity general aerobic warm-up. So the purpose of this is to increase that active range of motion and or stability, and also to increase body awareness. So the active range of motion concept, I'll get into it again. So your range of motion is how far your joints can move and relative to each other and through space. And the active component of that is that it is kind of like you have this range of motion that you're comfortable working within. So if you were completely cold and you sat down on an erg and you just tried to do full stroke rowing, it might feel a little bit harder than if you built up to that and we're already warm. Actually, maybe a better example would be bending over to like touch your toes or to tie your shoes. If you're already a bit warm, you're less likely to feel uncomfortable in these end ranges of motion. So these exercises would be looking at it, in some areas increasing mobility and then in other areas increasing stability. So most people spend their days in seated sedentary positions. Like hopefully we're remembering to stand up and break it up every once in a while. But the majority of us spend our days sitting and maybe in a slight forward posture, hunched over, and rowing actually does not break us out of this shoulder posture. We do spend a lot of time in the rowing stroke in a bit of a kyphotic posture. So to start off the dynamic exercises that we do in the warm-up, we would do some work for our hips, our thoracic spine, so the upper part of our back, and our scapula, so our shoulder blades, the two bones that move on the back and are the attachment point for our arms. You could also add in this section some specific areas of tightness. If you have like previously had some type of injury, or you know that you have really, really tight ankles, then you could focus on those as well. After a brief, like a couple dynamic stretch exercises for each of the hips, T-spine, scapula, you could move on to some body weight exercises. And in this case, we're looking for building that stability. So we want you to feel comfortable going through these ranges of motion. We also want you to get that trunk stable. So in rowing, we are, at least on the erg, we're just resisting flexion and extension as we're going back and forth on the slide. But when we're on the water, we're also resisting rotation when we're sweeping. So I like to include some type of anti-flexion exercise, anti-extension exercise, and I can't see the rest of my slide there, but I think it is anti-rotation. That's the last one. We'll talk about specific examples here at the end of the presentation. I just want to keep this light so that we could go through the whole flow of the thing. But also anybody, if anybody comes up with any questions throughout or wants to hear a specific example, because that will help your understanding of the warm-up, then please jump in. I don't have any of you muted yet. All right. After the dynamic warm-up, we would move into a light sport-specific activity. So this could be on water rowing or could be on the erg. So the goal of this is, again, to increase that body awareness, but we are starting to activate the energy, or we are continuing to activate the energy system. This is at a similar intensity to what we were doing for that light jog or light initial general activity. It's 5 to 10 minutes in length. And what I like to do personally is a technique progression. So I would start from the finish of the slide, doing arms only strokes, arms and body strokes, and then quarter slide, so just breaking the knees, half slide, 3/4 slide, full strokes. I row for a little bit lightly, and then I do the same progression from the front stop. So legs only, quarter strokes, half strokes, quarter of the leg drive, half of the leg drive, and then the full leg drive. So no body swing, no arms, and then the full legs, body swing, and then full stroke rowing. You can also row continuously with drills or technical focuses, like if you particularly need to focus on getting your hands out to straight or taking the catch with straighter arms. If you need to focus on keeping your shoulder blades down, you would have 5 to 10 minutes here of just light rowing where you think a little bit about these technical differences, technical changes. Again, though, the best time for technical changes is long before you're sitting down to do an erg test or something. You are really need to be working on that in your long C6 sessions every day. This is just a period where you could do a little refresher for yourself. Maybe it makes you feel more comfortable for the race. The real purpose here is just to get a little bit of sport specific energies, like revving your energy systems at sport specific exercise before we move on to moderate and high intensity sport specific exercise. So this is 10 to 20 minutes in length, but this is where we really get the energy systems ready for the requirements of the exercise itself. We would also get an increase in neuromuscular function from a more solid effort. So everything that we've done up until this point has really been to make you comfortable, get your body awareness up, get your body temperature up. This is what really matters for the exercise session that you're doing. You need to do some work beforehand that is hard. The exception being for C6 activities. For C6 activities, you could go from a light sport-specific activity right into C6 because the C6 is at steady state. Your body should be readily adapted as soon as your temperature is warm. Your body shouldn't struggle to adapt to the steady state. So my definitions, or what I would do here to get these minutes in at the moderate intensity and at high intensity would be some rate work or like at a consistent effort for around 5 minutes. I spell it out more towards the end of the slides. So this is moderate intensity, I think of as being like our C5. So like C6 is light, like C6, C7, not a real category, but that's like the light intensity. And then we get into the moderate as the C5. You could do it for a really long time, but you do have to do a little bit of effort. So at least 5 minutes of this prior to your piece. And then I would have 10 minutes set aside where I would include bouts of increasing intensity over the course of 10 minutes. So it's not like it's a steady ramp. It's like you do a minute at a certain intensity and then rest for 30 seconds of like active light rowing, and then another minute at a slightly higher intensity. And this would continue until you've reached the intensity of the workout itself. So with that in mind, the harder the workout, the more of a warm-up that you need to do. And I would keep it within 10 minutes and not accrue more than like 5 minutes of hard intervals here. Again, I spell it out what I would do for a 2K later on. One exception for this intensity and like how hard and your warm-up has to be is when you're warming up for peak power tests. To warm up for a peak power test, you're better off doing like this gradual increase and then so all of this dynamic, the light sport specific activity, and then not doing this moderate 5-minute continuous at like a C5 intensity. At this point, you would be better off to stop rowing and just do progressively more intense like 5 to 10 stroke bursts. So a 5 to 10 stroke burst at the regular drag factor, and then increase the drag factor up to 190, rest for a minute, 2 minutes, do a burst of 5 strokes again, getting towards your max, rest for a minute or two, just because that test relies very specifically on the high energy phosphate energy system. So Camille's going to talk about that next week, but it is a system where we don't need to have our aerobic system with fully active there. So I'll talk a little bit about the energy systems here, but tune in next week for Camille to discuss that as well. So energy stories, long story short. So we have the high energy phosphates and the anaerobic glycolytic system. So these two systems are very fast. They're ready to go without any warm up technically, but they are not sustainable. So we have a finite amount of these two energy systems. So we can think about it as like a finite amount of work that can be done with these energy systems, but we want to be able to like save that. So if you want to have a big sprint finish, or if you're the type of person who like flies and dies right off the start, you want to use it all when you want to use it when you have to use it. We also have the other energy system, which is aerobic glycolysis and fat oxidation, which is sustainable. So if you are able to, it would be preferable that you could use your sustainable energy source as much as possible, and then have these this anaerobic capacity on top of that. So as much as possible, we rely on the aerobic, the sustainable energy, and then we also have this anaerobic that we can add, just like the mustard on top, that big sprint finish, we save it for that. Okay.
That, of course, is assuming a great big training background.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
That
if it's big. So you can definitely increase your anaerobic capacity. Different people will have different amounts, but you could have two people having the same erg test, like the same like performance, with vastly different anaerobic capacity. So one person could have a much higher sustainable energy output through glycolysis and fat oxidation, and they may not be able to sprint to save their life. And then another guy could be a big horse who sprints really hard at the start, sprints really hard in the finish, but in the middle, because their sustainable energy output is so low, they have got a big U in their power output, and then they ramp it up again when they can see the red buoys. All right. So since we want to get that sustainable energy in our, like, we want to be able to use that sustainable energy as much as possible. The diagram on our left here shows that your oxygen response in exercise isn't immediate. So this square wave increase in the energy demand would be like if you were to be sitting on the erg and then all of a sudden be at the intensity that you're going to hold for the workout. So if this was 2K, actually 2K is a bad example because you wouldn't ever hit like a steady state like they show here. But if you're going to be doing like a 6K, yeah, you'd hit it. Some people would hit it for a 6K. You would have this period where your oxygen uptake was adjusting. So for steady state, it should be very quick. Like your heart just pumps more, your heart just expands, pumps more blood, your vessels dilate, and you're at the muscle level, your oxygen kinetics are readily able to switch into the steady state of something that is below your lactate threshold. This is getting a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to leave it to Camille to explain this other stuff, or we could do it again some other time. But the point that I'm making here, you guys can't see me pointing at stuff in my mouse. Oh, can you guys see my mouse?
Yeah.
Nope. Well, yeah.
Super. Okay.
Yeah,
So if the exercise is more intense, so if the square wave is higher, so if we're starting out at a higher energy expenditure, so higher power output, it takes longer and longer to get to a steady state if we're able to at all. So in this in this diagram that we have on the right, this GET is your lactate threshold, or approximately it's your gas exchange threshold. This next one's critical power. Next one's VO2 max. We can talk about these at another time if you guys would like. So underneath lactate threshold, they get to steady state pretty quickly. So the kinetics flatten out. So this is their oxygen uptake on the left. This is time. And they get to a nice flat steady state pretty quickly when it's underneath the lactate threshold. When we get above the lactate threshold, it takes a bit longer, but these were untrained people. They do eventually get to something of a steady state here. So once we're above critical power being the highest sustainable steady state. Most people can only sustain it for like 20 minutes, but they still call that steady state because everything does kind of flatline for a while. But above that, you never hit a steady state. So this person was able to do the full 6 minutes, barely, but they didn't hit steady state, their oxygen was still adjusting all the way to the end. And if they were at even higher intensities, I think this one's VO2 max. Yeah, one of these would be VO2 max and the other one would be above VO2 max. They can't make it the whole way, and their oxygen never reached any type of steady state. So with exercise, sorry, I'm gonna move this Camille's head around here. I'm moving it to the side there. All right, so point being, greater the intensity, the slower the kinetics will be, and at some point, you're never gonna be able to reach a steady state anymore. But that being said, if you do a preceding bout of exercise, your oxygen kinetics will increase more quickly. So in this case, these are supra-lactate threshold, so above lactate threshold again. So the heavy intensity exercise seen in the last page. So it took them a while to get to steady state. They didn't really quite get there, but they did a better job when they did it again a couple minutes later. Their oxygen adjusted more quickly. And in this work bout, can't see the time there, they would have used less of their anaerobic capacity because they shifted the line. I tried to point with my finger there, but I'll point with the mouse. They shifted the line of the oxygen kinetics towards more of a square wave. The ideal, which doesn't exist, would be if people could just like instantaneously increase their oxygen up to the demands of the exercise or up to VO2 max, but that just doesn't happen. So we have to use a little bit of our anaerobic capacity, but the better a job we do of warming up, the less of our anaerobic capacity we'll have to use. All right, but it does matter how intense our warm-up is. So we can compare from our graphs on the left to our graphs on the right here, where in this case, this preceding bout was below lactate threshold, and the next one was above, and they didn't have as nice they didn't reach steady state in either case, but I would argue that this was closer to steady state than that one. They definitely had more accelerated oxygen kinetics in this case than in this one. So it does matter that we reach an intensity comparable to what we're going to be doing for the exercise itself. All right. So just that, I talked about this a little bit earlier, that type of light exercise like C6, C7 doesn't really get the oxygen kinetics fired up. Most people are underneath their lactate threshold there, and it needs to be a little bit higher than that to get the oxygen kinetics really going. But once you get the oxygen kinetics, so when I'm saying oxygen kinetics, what I mean is that your body has made adjustments. So your heart is already stretched out a little bit. Your vessels are already dilated. Your oxygen, like your body upregulates enzymes and can have some acute increases in the enzymes that help in using energy aerobically, so using oxygen. So that's where the oxygen kinetics comes from there. The category 5 exercise for 5 to 6 minutes would be enough to get that effect, and that effect could last for 40 minutes afterwards. To get to the desired intensity for the workout, I would have athletes go from working from the C5 that they do for 5 or 6 minutes, and then do small bouts building up to the intensity that they're going to do, that they're going to need to do for the exercise session itself. So and there is potentially some benefit to going a little bit beyond what the exercise intensity of the session needs to be, because it might make it feel easier. You might have this post-activation potentiation effect where, because you have done something harder, it feels relatively easier. You're more readily able to perform at a lower intensity after the fact. So like doing a real start might make your like a real start and sprint for like 30 seconds might make your start and transition into your 2K pace feel so much easier afterwards. So I wouldn't do any intervals shorter than 30 seconds though. In my personal experience, I always did 20 to 40 strokes with one 1 minute piece. The reason being is that no matter what the intensity is, so even if you're starting just slightly higher than lactate threshold, you will have a time delay. So there will be a delay in how long you're like in activating your oxygen kinetics to, oh, you guys still can't see me. I'm pointing with my hands over here.
Your laser pointer's not working very well.
Yeah, I should have put another diagram in here. But if we can go back, oh, that's the good one. Okay, so if we can go back to something like this, if we're having successive bouts, so picture that we had more and more of these in a row, if they were going each higher and higher each time, that would be ideal. And we want the jumps to be modest in between them so that your like oxygen system is actually what's adjusting. So over the course of this person's little intervals that they were doing, their oxygen increased and then it decreased. And then it came up faster for this next one. So if this next one was just a little bit higher, we could get a similar percentage of the work being done in that bout by the VO2. We don't want it to be that these bouts are so short. So if it was stopping here, that you didn't actually get all of the all of the O2 increase that you could have for that bout. So the issue I see with people doing like 10 stroke bouts is that I'm not sure I cut off the time wasn't on here because this was an old one. But if this was a third as long, then very little of that works because it was a square wave to like up to here. Very little of this work would have been done by the aerobic system. We would have used all of this anaerobic system. If a bout is a bit longer, like 30 seconds to a minute, a greater percentage of that bout will have to come from the aerobic energy sources, and it does force your aerobic system to adapt each time to each new workload. And so we're increasing that and increasing that. I recall talking with you about this once, Walter, about how like very elite athletes prior to their testing will just have like a one and done approach where they do like a single bout, and correct me if I'm misremembering this, but that would be like a minute long, so a minute 30 long probably, and it's maximal, and they can recover in time for their next race. So two things is that's probably really maximal, and they are fit enough to recover from a maximal effort to an exercise session like 10 to 20 minutes later. But in that case, I am sure that those people would have done a full warm-up 40 minutes before they got on the water. They probably did an extensive warm-up. They probably did a pre-row that morning. What I recommend is to do something like these bouts. And again, I'm not sure if you're in the call at the time, but I talked about how this is aimed really at rec and like LTAT, like the long-term athlete development stages of 3 to 5, I think is what I said. Because if you're really competitive, you're going to do more stuff than this, and you're going to have different constraints. Like at an elite regatta, like what those Irish guys, I think you told me it was the Irish guys that were doing that.
Yes.
They would have a pre-row in the morning. They then have like their weigh in, they refuel, they do their actual like dry land warm up, and then they only have a certain amount of time that they're allowed to be on the water. So they probably do a whole bunch of dry land stuff, and then they stop worrying about it once they get out on the water. They just do their one piece. Probably they practice their start because their starts are amazing. They do their start and then they bleed into like the first 500 of the race or something. And then they just light paddle until they get out there for that race. Like that physiologically makes sense too, but you have to have a pretty high level of training to do that and to recover enough from like that long and a maximal effort. And also they probably did a whole bunch of stuff beforehand.
Yeah, well, that's what I understand. I was told, well, I read about it actually for the training that the physiologist who was consulting with the Irish team had them do that 1 minute burst early on in their warm up, and then it was light paddling on their on water warm up, and then it was light
Mhm.
paddling with a couple of starts. But
I
yes, it
def
was the Olympics. It wasn't.
yeah.
It wasn't Calgary for the 1500 meter novice race.
Mhm. I definitely recommend like doing a minute at pace if possible. I'll go through my ideal 2K. I think it might be the next slide. But I keep it. I think that people should do like this step interval system that like. Oh, another thing I didn't really mention there is so we are making a transient. Oh, you can't see my hands. We are making a transient effect on your oxygen kinetics. We're making it go slightly faster by having you warm up
Yep.
beforehand. But there's always going to be some delay. The more you train, so if an athlete who's very highly trained can, they would also have a increase from like no warm up to warm up. Like there's still a benefit for them to do it, but they have faster kinetics all the time. So we can, with training, you can increase the percentage of the energy contribution that comes from oxygen, because your oxygen kinetics will go faster. And it is relative, so it's relative to the amount of work that you do. But I think it was faster at VO2 max and trained relative, like very well trained compared to collegiate. I got a paper open from rowers after, so I can take a look at that after this to confirm. So I talked about those. So the modest jumps allow the O2, the oxygen system to respond. Warm-up intervals at greater than the intensity, that would be for the more of the neuromuscular benefit. So it makes it seem relatively easier to go at a lower intensity if you've done something like a peak power, or if you do like a real start and just paddle it out, like your 2K pace will feel easier relative to those maximal strokes. You also want to have a mild level of acidosis. So I remember when I was a junior that there was a bit of a concern that you'd work too hard in the warm-up, but our coach, who had been training for the Beijing 8, basically just laughed at us and said that there's no way any of you are going to warm up too hard. The real threat is that you don't do any warm up at all, and that is what happens all the time with juniors. So we want to tell people that it's okay to have a little bit of a burn in their legs after the warm up. Like you can keep rowing it out, and maybe the burn will fade a little bit with a little more continuous activity, but you definitely don't want to be leaving the interval, the hard part of the warm up, without having felt a bit of fatigue, a bit of a burn in your leg, because otherwise it will be just such a shock when you get out there and actually have to do it for 2,000 meters or whatever your workout is. So I definitely want to have a little bit of that feeling before a 6K too. And the exception might be with a minute test. I do pretty much all this stuff, but I don't try to get a big feeling of burn for the minute test. But it would.
Well, it also
sense
turns
that you
on your
want it.
systems for clearing the lactates out too. So
Yeah, intervals do both. They give you the acid and they train you to remove it because you have that downtime in between.
Yep.
All right. So this is what I would consider to be the ideal warm-up for the group that this presentation is aimed at. To do some type of 5 minutes of continuous exercise at the start, then 5 minutes of dynamic warm-up. We can go through some exercises afterwards about what I think you should include. Then 10 minutes of light erging, my preference being some type of technical progression. It doesn't have to be as many stages as I mentioned earlier, but a technical progression, and then some C6, maybe with some drills or technical focuses. then that 5 minutes of C5, so 5 minutes of consistent effort. You could play with the rates a little bit there, but I wouldn't go harder than C5, but you definitely don't want it to be as easy as C6. You want to feel it a little bit here. You would then proceed into 10 minutes of erging where you include some intervals. In this case, this would be my preference, would be something like 1 minute at C4, paddle it out for 30 seconds to a minute, 1 minute at 6K pace, paddle it out for 30 seconds to a minute, 30 seconds at 2K pace, paddle it out, 1 minute at 2K pace, paddle it out, 30 seconds start, paddle it out for a minute or two, and then aim to be done that 10 minutes before the test starts, because your system will stay active. You can just do some light activity to stay warm or throw a layer on. But you should definitely aim to be seated for the 2 minutes prior to the test start. All right. And then I have this slide for, this could be printed out, or you guys could review this afterwards, but this is just a summary that we could use. And that is it for the presentation. I also have a section here where I talk about what you could do if you weren't going to go for the run beforehand. Like that, I would consider that to be the easiest part to cut about what I put together there. So an alternative to having this light aerobic activity at the top here would just be to switch up your dynamic warm-up to have more body weight exercises initially. So this would get your body temperature up. That should be like 3 or 4 minutes of work there. And then go into the dynamic stretches. Remember what I had for the description of the dynamic warm-up in this order, where you had just gone for a run or just gone on the bike for a while. You actually start with the dynamic stretching and then move into the exercises. So I have the reverse here. You would start with body weight exercises, then move into some dynamic stretches, but you wouldn't have to do quite as much of the body weight exercises because you've already done a whole bunch to get warm in the first place. I just have some examples of what I think the key exercises should be, and we can review them afterwards.